we're starting with this painting because it captures a moment, the moment of peace between the Catholics and the Moors after many centuries of fighting over domination of the Iberian Peninsula, aka Spain and Portugal. And this took many centuries and culminated with this treaty, this peace treaty, or at least a negotiations, whereby the Muslims gave up Granada and the Catholics were able to unify their country, Spain, under the houses of Aragorn and Castile. That's Isabella on the right. She's the one who would go on to grant Columbus his ships to sail to the New World. So this is a very momentous date historically because it means a lot, not only for Spain, but also for the world, as we'll see in a moment. And it's also a kind of inauspicious beginning to a whole new era, which is the age of Columbus, because the end of this warfare was the beginning of a new form of battle. So remember that this painting was painted in the 1800s, reflecting back on the birth of modern Spain, when Spain triumphed over the Muslims who had been occupying Spain for many decades. And the Spanish in 1492 finally took control of the Iberian Peninsula, the same year that Columbus set sail across the ocean. So 1492 is a very important date for Spain and for the rest of the world, and I think sets the stage for the conquest of the New World, and is very almost a mean-spirited moment of history because the Spanish take all this bloodthirsty kind of warfare against the Muslims and transfer it, redirect it towards the conquest of the New World, the Aztec Empire. So that's why I'm showing you this painting, because this new era we're entering will be an era very much characterized by war and violence. And even though this is a painting of peace, it really is kind of a moment of peace after many centuries of fighting, and a moment of peace prior to many more centuries of, at least a century or two of violence, not only in the New World between the Catholics and the Aztec Empire, but also back in Europe with the Protestants and the Catholics fighting. And that's not to say anything about the Muslims conquering many parts of the world, as you can see in this map as well. So this is the moment where where the Catholics finally push back against the Muslim expansion into Europe. So very kind of big shift in power in Spain. And so many things are happening. And remember, this is definitely, you have to think about this in the context of the fall of Constantinople in 1453. And that triggers a domino effect, including Columbus setting sail, seeking an alternative route to India, because now that route is closed, and others will seek a route around Africa, like Vasco da Gama and the Portuguese. Columbus goes intrepidly across the ocean, and the rest is history. Now, Columbus was, I think, more of a discoverer. He didn't have a plan to conquer people. He might have inadvertently, but the real conquest came in the form of smallpox. But that's not to say that there wasn't a kind of fever for violence in the backdrop, and that really is represented by someone like Cortez or Pizarro, the people who came in the wake of Columbus, who once he found out he hadn't arrived in India, he had found a new world, then they had to recalibrate their aspirations and geography, of course. And Cortez and others who had gotten whiffs of gold, who heard that there was gold somewhere in the mainland in Mexico, they are the ones who really zeroed in on conquest and extracting gold and glory from the New World. And sadly, all that bloodshed in Spain, at least sadly for the Aztecs, really prepared the Spanish for the violent confrontation with the Aztecs. And it was a very lopsided confrontation between the Aztecs and the Spanish in terms of numbers, in terms of millions of Aztecs versus hundreds of Spaniards. But the Spanish had horses, they had guns, they had armor, and they had germs, and those are play a big role in tipping the balance. But not that it really is more than just that, as we'll see in a moment. So one thing driving the Spanish is this myth of Santiago. Santiago means Saint James, and he's known as the Moor Slayer, the guy who kills the Moors. So Spanish Catholicism is very kind of fused with violence. These many centuries of violence against the Muslims occupying Spain led to this imagery that you see in churches with Santiago on horseback cutting off the heads of the Muslims you see below. Almost a startling thing to see in a church, someone seeing violence so celebrated in the church, but it really goes to the heart of the kind of nature of this religious war and the insurmountable differences between two religions. And this will later give way to a kind of world of relativism where different religions have to figure out how to live in peace. But for now, we live in a time of violence where the Spanish feel this sense of entitlement to conquer anyone who stands in their way, especially anyone who resembles Moors or who is seen as less civilized than the Spanish, and certainly anyone who's non-Catholic. So what's going on is the Spanish are projecting their experience in Spain fighting against the Moors and against basically Africa, and they're projecting that onto the Aztec Empire when they arrive to the New World. And the word Santiago Matamoros literally means Moor slayer. So he's really goes hand in hand with this idea of violent conquest against the Moors occupying Spain. And people like Cortez take that whole idea and they take it to heart and they transfer it over to the conquest of the Aztecs in the New World. And so it raises all these questions eventually. What do you do with the people who survive the conquest? Do they convert to Christianity? Are they slaves? As you can see, Queen Isabella has to figure that out, and she decides, well, they won't be enslaved if they convert to Christianity, which is not very merciful, I think we'd agree, but still is better than just enslaving everyone. But the problem, of course, is the Spanish in the New World are very far away from Spain. It's very hard to enforce rules from far away, and very slowly and surely the Spanish colonies will eventually gain a sense of autonomy, which eventually will lead to independence. But that's several decades, if not, I mean, centuries away. For initially, though, there's a lot of conflict and a lot of issues surrounding, well, do you how do you convert the natives who survive? How do you extract as much gold as possible without decimating the Native American populations, which will already be wiped out mostly by smallpox? And of course, they want to find gold and other things to pay back the queen. And Columbus is certainly focused on showing some kind of gain for the investment of the ships that the queen gave him. But he's not as kind of ruthless and reckless, or at least ruthless, as people like Cortez. And I think this picture, I think, shows you this sort of tension and awkward moment where Columbus is arriving in the New World. And this etching is a print that people shared with others in Europe and beyond. And it must have been remarkable to kind of see how this new world is unfolding. So definitely a great chance to see artwork chronicling history as it unfolds. Obviously, it's not photographic and it's not accurate as you'd expect from a photograph, but I think you can see they're using scale and movement to show this exchange between Columbus and the others, the Native Americans there. And the depictions of the Native Americans really emphasize the kind of barbaric side, nudity, and the Spanish, the Catholics, with their long history of Christianity dealing with nudity and non-Christians, it's very easy for them to kind of to see the Native Americans as, quote, savages or less civilized and certainly not Catholic. And they saw practices like human sacrifice that really made them feel this sense of superiority, and therefore that much easier to just steal the gold from these people, especially people like Cortez. But it wasn't so easy to it's not just a matter of conquering a huge empire like the Aztec Empire. Is more requires more than a boldness or desire. And smallpox definitely contributed a lot to that. But it occurred in different stages, and I'm going to go through those stages today. You can see Columbus had many different journeys, and on his journey, he had a few of the orders, the religious orders. Like the Dominicans and others who were witnessing and kind of have their parallel accounts of what's going on in the New World. And some of them did express outrage about the treatment of the Native Americans. Even Columbus, in fact, was very upset that other Spaniards were mistreating the Native Americans. So Columbus does have more of he gets lumped in with Cortez and Pizarro and the others, I think somewhat unfairly. But certainly the Spanish conquered the New World and conquered the people of the New World. There's no doubt about that. But it's a little more complicated when you get into the details, and we're going to do that now. So remember that this reconquest of Spain leads right into the conquest of the New World. And here are the Spanish arriving in the New World, a different depiction. But the reality of the next phase with the conquerors is something like this. So here is Cortez wearing, knight in shining armor. Any comments? Is this so let me ask you guys, is this a positive portrayal of the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, or would you say this is negative? Like, are the Spanish sympathetic here, or are we meant to see them as not sympathetic?
Probably not sympathetic
Why do you say that?
due to the mainly the death occurring around them and how they seem indifferent to it.
How they're what?
How they seem indifferent.
Yeah, I think that's the heart of it. That they're, one big key part of it is they all this kind of massacre behind around them, and he's not really doing anything to show compassion or to, it's you kill your enemy, and you can still kind of, comfort them before they die. And more importantly, the lopsided quality of someone in knight in shining armor killing someone who doesn't even have anything but a loincloth on is quite unfair. And so we tend to root for the underdog, and in this case, the underdog are the Aztecs. And so this is really, I think, reframing the conquest of the New World as a massacre and not as anything glorious. We expect a knight in shining armor to act accordingly. And here he's just kind of looking down indifferently, as you said, at the Aztec soldier who's in a crucified Jesus Christ-like position with a woman in the back who's almost like the Virgin Mary reaching out with baby Jesus underneath. So a lot of Catholic imagery infused into this picture. Another example of a painting in the late 1800s looking back on the birth of modern Mexico. And in this case, not putting rosy colored glasses on, but rather showing it in a kind of stark reality and almost horrifying greed and indifference by the Spanish. So, yes, a very important update on, and I think unflinching view of what actually took place. And this is during Cortez's march. On his way to the Aztec capital. And he did this massacre to send a message to Montezuma and the other groups who were allied with the Aztecs. And importantly, the Aztecs had only consolidated power in the late 1400s, and they had a lot of enemies. And this is important because when Cortez arrives in the New World, one of the first things he does is he finds a translator who's able to translate. He meets a Spanish Maroon named Aguirre, and Aguirre can speak Maya, and he knows a woman who can translate from Maya to Aztec, and her name is Malinche. So Cortez leaves Havana initially with permission from the governor. Then the permission's revoked. Cortez says to heck with it. I'm still going to go. So this path is his route all the way to Mexico City. Along the way, he meets a translator, and the translator really helps him understand the stakes. He understands that the Aztecs have a lot of enemies, and he knows that the Aztecs have a lot of gold. And very importantly, Cortez, who is a lawyer by training, he allies with the enemies of the Aztecs, right? The enemy of your enemy is your friend. So he knows all this because Malinche, his translator, is the one who's able to basically give him a good understanding of the political landscape. And so, knowing there's a lot of gold in the Aztec Empire, knowing they have a lot of enemies, he starts marching towards the Aztec capital with thousands and then tens of thousands of Native Americans following in train, all the while probably getting infected with smallpox gradually. So that's creeping in the background the whole time with the smallpox infecting the Native Americans. And the Spanish didn't know about this initially. Later on, there's accounts that the Spanish deliberately spread smallpox. But for now, Cortez is just using his boldness and his brain to try to navigate his way to the Aztec Empire. And keep in mind, the Aztec Emperor Montezuma, he also is kind of playing a game of cat and mouse or chicken or brinksmanship with Cortez because Montezuma wants to know who this guy is who showed up with these ships and is really kind of trying to figure out if Cortez is an enemy, if he's a friend. Cortez arrives with maybe 100 men, 100 horses, and so it doesn't represent an invasion. But Montezuma really wants to scratch the surface and figure out what Cortez wants, and probably wants to satisfy a little bit of his curiosity, and eventually arranges a meeting between the two. And so Cortez is kind of playing a political game, but along the way he has to confront a bunch of different hostile tribes that are either connected to the Aztecs or enemies who just don't want any foreigners kind of invading their territory. And the Spanish are up against, thousands of Aztecs. The problem is the Aztecs have obsidian blades and a lot of really fanciful costumes, but the Spanish have armor and they have horses, and more importantly, they have gunpowder. And whenever Cortez's men reach a kind of a point where they're just swarmed by Aztec warriors, Cortez would just fire his cannon, and the boom and the blast of the cannon would terrify the Aztecs, and they'd go running because they never heard anything except maybe a volcano that was that loud. So the Spanish really had this technological advantage over the Aztecs. Just showing you this. This is actually Cortez and Malinche, painted by one of my favorite artists, a Mexican named Orozco, in the 1920s. So this is an artist in the 1900s reflecting back on this sort of original sin moment, if you will. I say that because it's almost like Adam and Eve here, the emphasis on nudity and the blending of the two groups, the Spanish and Malinche there on the right. Now, she would go on to become the first noblewoman in the New World. Here you can see her. This is a drawing by one of the friars who joined Cortez on this conquest, and he's documenting the conquest all the way to the Aztec Empire. Those Native Americans on the back are actually, they might be slaves, enslaved warriors, but they might also be volunteers with the allies of the Spanish, also the enemies of the Aztecs. And there's Malinche in the front. And here's an example of what the battle looked like with thousands of, Aztecs swarming the Spanish, who had horses and steel and gunpowder. And really, I mean, what can you do unless you really stab the horse really hard? It's hard to penetrate steel. So really a lopsided war, even though the Aztecs really had numbers on their side, they didn't have the technological kind of instruments of power that the Spanish had. But it's really not that so much as Cortez having Malinche. She's really the key to his success because her translation helped him understand the political landscape and ally with the enemies of Montezuma. This is not Malinche, but her counterpart in Peru, a Native American woman who became Spanish nobility because she was awarded nobility because of her help conquering the Aztecs. And you can't really blame her because she was a slave who basically became kind of a slave to the Spanish. But she has a lot of controversy surrounding her in Spain because she's seen as a traitor by the Native Americans in Mexico or as a liberator by the people of Spanish descent in Mexico. So she's still a source of controversy, but she's really key to Cortez's victory. He marches all the way to the Aztec capital, which is on an island located in a lake in the middle of Mexico. Now all of this is Mexico City, just sprawling. The lake is buried underneath all kinds of urbanization. And the myth for the founding of the Aztec Empire was this eagle with a bird in its mouth on top of a cactus. And that was where they decided to build their capital. And here it is. It's really breathtaking and something they write about. We know all this that I'm telling you because Cortez wrote a diary, and you can read it in Spanish or in English, depending on, if you speak Spanish at all. I had read it in Spanish in college. It was really interesting. It still is really fascinating. And those two bars, these two bands that you see on the Mexican flag actually correspond to those two causeways that reached the Aztec capital called Tenochtitlan, which had floating gardens and a sacred precinct in the middle with pyramids. So really a beautiful place that the Spanish were completely awestruck by. So here you can see the flag with the eagle in the middle. And even the Mexican flag today has the eagle on the cactus with the snake in its mouth. So when you look at the Mexican flag, you're actually looking at an Aztec symbol on the modern colors of Mexico. So this is a painting by Diego Rivera, who paints this in the 20th century as a way to atone for the many decades, centuries of conquest of the New World and the kind of the subjugation of the Native Americans, and of course, you could say their genocide by smallpox and conquest. And so he's trying to resurrect the memory of the Aztecs using his painting and doing a wonderful job, I'd say. You really don't see anything like this in the Old World or in the United States with these pyramids and ziggurat style structures. You really have to go to Mexico to see it. And here's Montezuma famously kind of had this foreshadowing of the end of the world with a meteorite, a comet passing. Pardon me, a comet passing. So there are a lot of prophecies about the end of the world, like in a lot of religions. And Aztec religion, the imagery can be pretty terrifying or nightmarish, snakes and dragons and demons. I think, most religions have some terrifying imagery in the religion, especially in hell. But, something uniquely nightmarish about Aztec artwork. The skeletons, this is Coatlicue, the goddess with the snakes on her skirt and a skeletal head. I'm sure she's charming, but, once you get to know her. And so, yeah, these sculptures were buried underground for many centuries until they were unearthed in the 1800s, because the Spanish would deliberately try to bury Aztec history as a way to erase it so that it wouldn't inspire any kind of rebellion against the Spanish after the wave of conquest, which would last until the mid 1500s. By the late 1500s, really, I think most of the Aztecs were either dead or the ones who survived were really would maybe had were learning Spanish and as well as their native language. So conversion took place after conquest, converting people to the new religion, and they wanted to bury all these artifacts so that there was no question about Catholicism being the new supreme religion of the land. So a very sad moment for art history, I guess, and of course for the Aztec Empire, because especially because of smallpox. But for a moment, you see, Cortez for I think a few months is living in the sacred precinct in Tenochtitlan, conversing with Montezuma, using his translator there. You see in the back, Malinche. And Montezuma's trying to play, trying to keep his cards close. Cortez is trying to keep his cards close. And Cortez knows that he can't win a battle using guns and steel because there's just too many Aztecs. And Montezuma, for his part, has a lot of advisors telling him, "Don't, don't do anything. Don't let the Az. Hold on, just a moment." He says, don't let the Spanish, don't trust the Spanish. You can't trust them. They are going to conquer us, or that, there's no reason to trust them. And so the Aztecs are really kind of apprehensive about but Montezuma doesn't really listen. He wants to kind of see how things go, how things unfold. And sadly, that plays out very badly for Montezuma because in the end, he ends up being killed by his own people because they think they basically betrayed him. So the Spanish were really awestruck by the practice of human sacrifice. That's key to the Aztec religion. You could say human sacrifice is definitely part of the Christian religion, but not in any sort of regular basis, right? You've got that. I think killing people in the gladiator games was seen as distasteful and outlawed by the Christians by the early centuries AD. So it definitely leaves a bad taste in the Spaniard's mouth to see human sacrifice, but it was really more opportunism where they see this and it gives them a moral justification to conquer people who they see as savages. But that's not to say that the people being sacrificed here were not at all happy at all about being sacrificed, and that's why the Aztecs had so many enemies because they would call populations and for sacrifice, and that was a way of kind of restoring balance to the universe, sacrificing people. And yeah, so that was a big part of the Spanish justifying their conquest of the Aztecs. And here you can see the battle that took place. So after a few months of hanging out with Montezuma and kind of learning as much as he could, Cortez decides, all right, the time has come to make a move, or else we're going to get, killed by all the Aztecs. And so Cortez captures Montezuma and basically uses him as kind of collateral to prevent the Aztecs from doing anything to him. And over, a few weeks, gradually the Aztecs start deciding, okay, hold on, he's taken our emperor hostage. We have to do something. And Cortez realizes the clock is ticking, and in the middle of the night, with his horses keep probably they probably put some kind of thing to keep their hooves from making too much noise. They try to sneak out of the Aztec capital in the middle of the night. And they almost make it. Those long causeways stretch all the way across the lake, and they almost make it, except someone probably kicked a can or, stumbled or made some noise, and then all the Aztecs stirred to life, and it became a really just like insane moment of escape from the Aztec capital. Again, we know this because it was written down by the Spanish, and many other sources confirm the accuracy of the accounts. And the Spanish had to flee across the causeway, and Cortez nearly died. He fell into the ocean, fell into the lake, I mean, and people had to rescue him. And he was really worried about losing horses, a lot more worried about losing his horses than his men, because he knew that the men could be replaced because he had already, and this is important, he had already dispatched dispatched a letter back to Cuba requesting reinforcements. And that was a very smart move because when he did finally escape from the Aztec capital, he was able to reunite with the Spanish reinforcements. And that's important because, one, the Spanish reinforcements initially were sent to capture Cortez because he defied the governor of Cuba and decided to go on with his conquest. And he basically burned his own ships so his men wouldn't change their mind about conquering the Aztecs. Well, when he finally meets up with these reinforcements, he tells them, "Hey, look, you can capture me, or we can go conquer this city over here. And if we do, we're going to make millions and billions of dollars of gold." And he's right. There is, millions and billions, if not trillions of dollars of gold in the Aztec capital. So the Spanish reinforcements agree, and they all go back with at this point, tens of thousands of allies who were, I think, waiting, around the edge of the lake to see what happened with Cortez and the other Spanish while they were with the Mexican emperor, the Aztec emperor Montezuma, who at this point is dead. His replacement is now in power, but more importantly, smallpox has now spread throughout the Aztec capital. And so Cortez returned to the lake with his reinforcements, and they decide to build a whole bunch of ships. And what unfolds is a naval battle for the conquest of the Aztec capital. At this point, there's no question that we're at full warfare. There's no diplomacy anymore. And so it's basically a naval battle between these ships that are built by the Spanish to navigate around the lake and the Aztecs, who have pontoon boats and have thousands, if not millions, of Aztec going against the Spanish. But of course, the Spanish have their allies as well as reinforcements. And Cortez really cares about the horses, the guns, and the cannons because that's really going to be what tips the balance in his favor. But ultimately, I think it was a game of attrition, a war of attrition, and it was smallpox spreading throughout the Aztec capital that finally forced the Aztec to give up. And so the naval battle, which decided the kind of outcome of this, conquest between the Spanish and the Aztecs, was really the thing that finally ended the stalemate, and of course smallpox as well. And the Spanish, adding insult to agony, would go on to take Cortez's body. Cortez died, many years later in Spain, and they returned his body back to Mexico and buried him on top of the sacred precinct in the former Aztec Empire. So that would be like the Muslims conquering Rome and then, burying, burying the Muslim conqueror in the Vatican as a way of saying, we conquered you, and the person who conquered you will always sit in a sacred place in your formerly sacred precinct. So it's really a form of kind of symbolic conquest by burying Cortez in the sacred precinct of the Aztecs. And here you can see a kind of updated view of the Aztec capital here as it expands and transforms into modern day Mexico City. This is called the Zocalo, the real big plaza in the middle of Mexico City. And underneath a lot of the architecture, you find Aztec ruins and Aztec temples because the Spanish deliberately buried under everything underneath Spanish architecture because it's very symbolic. It would be like almost just like, you could say this is paybacks for 1453. This is kind of, symbolic paybacks against the Muslims conquering Constantinople by kind of conquering the Aztecs, sort of projecting your own sense of defeat onto a weaker group to reclaim that feeling of conquest again. So, I mean, I'm not saying they deliberately did this to make up for Constantinople becoming, the Hagia Sophia becoming a mosque, but you could see that the Spanish were really kind of had this bloodthirsty desire to conquer, and that spread all the way to the New World. And underneath the columns you see in the sacred area of the Zocalo are Aztec masonry, and the surviving Aztecs, many of them, if they had any artistic skills, would be put to use for Catholic imagery. And there'll be really interesting examples of artwork, which I don't think we'll have time to look at today. So I think we'll save that for class on Monday. But a really interesting period of cross-pollination where the Spanish would use Aztec imagery as a way and blend them with Catholic imagery as a way to convert the surviving Aztecs to Christianity. So you can see a little bit of that on the right with at least the initial phase of extermination. Literally, these are Spanish Dominicans or Jesuits who are literally lighting on fire Aztec artwork. And so for many centuries, anyone with Native American heritage, darker skin was seen as kind of lower status, lower class than the Spanish, who are all kind of Iberian Spanish descent. And so it's an emerging caste system. A caste system emerges between the Spanish, the people who mixed with the Spanish and Native Americans, and the Native Americans down below. But even below that, as we'll see later, we have the addition of African slavery and slaves. And so the New World becomes a really, you could say, almost kaleidoscopic blend of different races, and an example of racial mixture you rarely see in human history. And it really represents a transformation in our idea of society and culture with all these different groups intermingling with, of course, the Spanish on the top, and a lot of paranoia about losing that elite power. And so one way of addressing this paranoia, of course, is converting the Native Americans to Catholicism. And one strategy they use is, using the feathers, using the artwork, the feathers that they see in Aztec religion. This is the crown of Montezuma, for instance, with quetzal feathers, sacred bird of the Aztecs and the Maya, and they start blending this feather art into Catholic imagery. So this is, the equivalent of like Jesus or, one of his disciples perhaps, with all of this hummingbird feathers in the back that add this iridescent backdrop to, and even the colors of the figure here are colored with, hummingbird feathers. So the real loser here are the Aztecs and the hummingbirds, but a real interesting example and a unique example of blending two religions. Um, and you could say this is a picture of Jesus, or you could say this is you could say this is Aztec Jesus. They kind of hybrid between Catholic art and Aztec art, with of course, the Catholic art being the guiding kind of underlying premise, or at least the winner of the contest. And the artwork, again, is trying to resonate with the Aztec culture enough to offer kind of a visual bridge so they could convert to Catholicism. So painting feathers, using feathers, and using Christian subject matter along with feathers is a strategy for converting the surviving Native Americans. Another is using color. So that bright red color is probably cochineal, which is extracted from the bug that eats the fruit of the cactus. You can see here the cochineal is harvested from the bug, and you squish the bug, and that bright red color comes out. And they use this because it's a much brighter red and more long lasting, and it becomes the color to use in European painting, and it's called Aztec red. And it's also the sacred color of Aztecs. You see this here in the backdrop. And likewise here, I think we saw examples of the Maya earlier this semester, the Bonampak murals using that red, that bright red. And here, and this is almost like uh, well, this is a religious painting showing the sacrifice and the release of the spirit that leads to the renewal, but feels almost like a last judgment, very Christian like, or similar to Christian imagery, the last judgment, all the souls kind of going up or down to heaven or hell. But here you can see the European painters start adopting this bright red color. So this is the beginning of another important element of this Columbian exchange, which is, transmitting things back and forth. First, we have conquest, then you have conversion, then you have this kind of this trading of goods and exchange of things into the new world and back and forth, including the evil institution of slavery, but also planting coffee in the new world, planting sugar, and extracting new resources, and finding new animals that they can harvest, and all kinds of things. And the other direction, you have colors like here, the Aztec red that goes to the old world and becomes the sort of go-to red for painters like Caravaggio. So on the right here, I mean, there's a painting of Jesus, and doubting Thomas poking his finger into Jesus, but it's also, you could say, an Aztec painting because they're using that Aztec color. So it is kind of a hybrid of two, the same way the other paintings we just saw with the feathers are also a hybrid. And you'd never know that looking at this, that, oh, that color derives from the Aztec color from the New World. So yeah, they're using it on both sides, or at least the Christians are using it to convert the Aztecs, and then I guess the Christians are using it just to kind of preserve the status quo back in Europe. And sadly, the Aztecs at this point, even the allies who allied with the Spanish, died during the conquest. So it's definitely a sad chapter for Aztec history. But on Monday, when we start talking again about this the aftermath of the conquest, we'll look at some more examples of religious art and how they used artwork to navigate the caste system that emerges, basically using painting to categorize people. And I'll show you an example of that on Monday. But just remember, in addition to the exchange back and forth, you have the people being wiped out by smallpox and the total destruction of basically entire empire.